When I first started investigating the architectural mysteries of the mid-19th century, I expected to find the usual explanations: industrial expansion, urban development, standard construction practices from a rapidly growing nation. Nothing unusual, nothing that would challenge accepted historical narratives. But the deeper I dug into the records, the more the evidence stopped making sense. Because between 1840 and 1850, something extraordinary happened across dozens of cities throughout North America and Europe, and historians still present it as perfectly normal, even though the physical evidence suggests anything but normal circumstances. Entire city blocks appear suddenly buried under dense, compacted layers of earth. Not gradual soil accumulation, not slow environmental changes, not decades of natural build-up. Instead, we see meters of sediment thick enough to swallow the first and even second floors of buildings that were clearly still in active use. The official explanations are always remarkably similar. Cities raised their street levels, drainage improvements required new elevations, urban planning demanded better grading, lower floors simply became basements. But when you examine these events, city by city, decade by decade, the explanations begin to crumble. These were not gradual municipal improvements. They were not isolated engineering projects. And they certainly did not follow the patterns of normal urban development. They appeared everywhere within the same narrow window of time, affecting cities that had no connection to each other, no shared planning committees, no coordinated development strategies. What first captured my attention was a series of early photographs from cities like Chicago, Boston, and Seattle. Every image revealed the same peculiar details. Doorways positioned far below street level, windows half buried beneath packed earth that looked almost deliberately placed, entire building facades cut off by sudden rises in ground elevation, workers digging downward instead of building upward, scaffolding constructed to reach new, higher street surfaces. And these were not abandoned ruins or neglected structures. These were functioning cities, operating normally while hiding something remarkable beneath their feet. As I expanded my research to include Kansas City, Omaha, and San Francisco, the consistency became impossible to dismiss. Every one of these cities reported massive street-raising projects during almost the exact same time period. Every one absorbed enormous quantities of earth, and in every case, the lower levels of existing buildings were buried, sealed, or simply written out of the architectural record. But here's the detail that mainstream historians never adequately address. The buried architecture often appears older, more precise, and more sophisticated than the new construction layered above it. Massive stone archways, masonry work too exact for the supposed tools of the era, foundations deeper than any official building plan would indicate. This raises uncomfortable questions. Why were entire cities burying floors that appeared structurally sound? Why did no municipality attempt to remove the sediment instead of simply raising streets around it? And why did the photographic documentation begin right at the moment these cities were supposedly digging themselves out? The contradictions led me deeper into engineering reports, city council minutes, and early geological surveys. That's where a term kept appearing quietly, indirectly, always in the margins of official documents. References to older foundations predating current construction plans. Structures that seemed to exist before their supposed builders arrived. Subterranean masonry of unknown origin. In other words, cities were uncovering buildings that did not match the architectural timeline historians claim, which leads to a disturbing possibility. These cities weren't built with buried floors. They were buried after they were built. The so-called street-raising projects may not have been construction at all. They may have been excavation, massive, coordinated excavation efforts across continents, all occurring within the same narrow historical window, right when a particular style of architecture begins disappearing from the visible world. Before we examine the specific evidence, the buried structures, the excavation photographs, and the engineering reports that somehow went missing, let me be clear about what we're investigating. This isn't speculation based on internet theories or modern conspiracy thinking. This is documented historical evidence that exists in official archives, photographed by legitimate companies, recorded in municipal documents that anyone can access. The challenge isn't finding the evidence. The challenge is understanding why it's been systematically ignored. When I traced the timeline between 1840 and 1850, one question kept surfacing. Were these cities really modernizing? Or were they uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden? Because when you study the structural alignments, the foundation depths, and the preserved architectural details, many of these buildings display characteristics that don't fit the accepted chronology. They show signs of advanced engineering techniques, precise mathematical proportions, and construction methods that supposedly didn't exist in frontier America. Which brings us to the central investigation of this series. What some researchers call the Great Excavation, a mid-19th century effort to dig out the remains of a previous civilization. A civilization that appears to have been buried in what can only be described as a massive mud flood event. The more I examined the archives, cross-referencing maps, engineering logs, and early urban photographs, one thing became undeniable. The events of 1840 to 1850 weren't random municipal improvements scattered across time. They were coordinated responses to something much larger, something buried, something inherited. Cities weren't just raising their streets, they were responding to a phenomenon that had affected entire regions simultaneously. Because once you compare these excavation operations side by side, a disturbing pattern emerges. Chicago, Kansas City, Omaha, Seattle, San Francisco. Different governments, different climates, different political systems, different founding dates. Yet the same phenomenon repeats with unsettling precision. Sudden layers of compacted earth covering older architecture. Excavation teams working downward instead of upward. Consistent sediment depths of 2 to 4 meters. Lower floors sealed and abandoned instead of restored. And architectural styles underneath that appear far older than the surface-level cities built later. This is where the official narrative becomes impossible to maintain. Because if a single city experiences unusual flooding or soil accumulation, that's explainable. If 2 cities report similar sediment buildup, that's still within the realm of coincidence. But dozens of cities across vast distances exhibiting identical burial depths, identical excavation patterns, identical architectural anomalies underneath. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. And it forced me towards something I didn't expect to confront so early in this research. The connection to what historical maps consistently labelled as Tartaria. Not the sensationalised internet versions, not the exaggerated claims, but the architectural consistency that appears in the buried layers of these American cities, because the structures being uncovered shared unmistakable characteristics, advanced stonework that surpassed contemporary capabilities, oversized archways built to proportions that dwarf 19th century construction, window arrangements and geometric patterns that appear across different cities despite having no shared architects or building plans, foundation work deeper, thicker, and more precise than what 1840s engineers could achieve with documented tools and techniques. To mainstream historians, these similarities represent nothing more than classical architectural influences spreading across a developing nation. But classical influences don't explain buried 3-story archways. They don't explain identical construction techniques in cities separated by thousands of miles. And they certainly don't explain why this sophisticated architectural style is consistently found in the buried layer, never on the surface. The surface. At this point, 2 possibilities demanded consideration. Either these cities all experienced natural disasters of identical magnitude within the same narrow time frame, or they were systematically excavating the remains of something that predated their official founding dates. The deeper I investigated, the more the second possibility gained credibility. City engineers throughout the 1840s complained repeatedly about encountering unexpectedly deep foundations during routine projects. Municipal records mention discovering rooms below what should have been ground level. Newspapers occasionally reported ancient stone layers uncovered during street improvements. Most of these references appear briefly, sometimes only a sentence or two, before vanishing from subsequent coverage, almost as if certain discoveries weren't meant to be documented at all. The strangest pattern emerged when examining what these cities chose to preserve versus what they chose to bury permanently. Municipal governments never removed all the accumulated earth. They cleared just enough to restore street access and building functionality, but left entire underground levels sealed forever. Why abandon fully constructed floors if the goal was urban improvement? Why not restore buildings to their original heights if you possess the labour and resources for massive excavation projects? The answer appears in what these official documents don't say, rather than what they do. Because digging deeper risked exposing architectural elements that didn't align with accepted timelines, elements that raised questions about who built these structures and when, which brings us back to the buried evidence itself. Not as mythology or alternative theory, but as documented architectural reality. Structures in Chicago, Seattle, Kansas City, and Omaha, all displaying what researchers recognize as sophisticated engineering signatures. The scale exceeds what frontier communities should have achieved. The geometry follows mathematical principles that weren't taught in American engineering schools. The precision surpasses what documented tools and techniques could accomplish. The material quality endures in ways that 19th century construction typically doesn't. These features don't align with the resources or capabilities attributed to their supposed builders, but they align perfectly with each other across vast geographical distances, as if following standardized construction protocols that transcended individual city planning. When I continued studying the photographic evidence, another detail emerged that historians consistently overlook. Every time excavation teams dug into these buried layers and exposed older architectural elements, the immediate response followed an identical pattern. Streets rebuilt higher than before, lower floors sealed behind new facades, original design elements removed or hidden behind conventional materials, surface architecture modified to appear more recent than the structures beneath. This wasn't restoration or renovation. This was systematic replacement of visible evidence, a coordinated effort to rewrite the architectural timeline by burying physical proof of earlier construction phases. The excavation documents reveal how deliberate this replacement process actually was. By examining municipal records from the 1840s and 1850s, something becomes unmistakably clear. Cities weren't adapting to street-level changes. They were fighting to reclaim access to buildings that had been rendered unusable by some extraordinary accumulation of earth. The sequence repeats across multiple locations. An unexplained layer of sediment appears around existing structures. Lower floors become inaccessible due to soil accumulation that reaches second-story windows. Work crews begin large-scale excavation projects focused on specific buildings rather than general area development. Only selected portions receive full excavation, while other areas remain permanently buried. The recovered spaces get sealed and forgotten rather than integrated into city planning. This resembles emergency recovery operations more than planned urban development, as if every affected city entered the same crisis response mode simultaneously, working to salvage what they could from buildings that had been overwhelmed by forces beyond municipal control. The timing makes this interpretation even more compelling. These excavation efforts coincided with what geological evidence suggests was the most significant climate disruption of the 19th century. Volcanic activity, unusual weather patterns, and atmospheric disturbances that affected global agricultural production and settlement patterns. Conditions that could have produced the massive soil displacement documented in these urban excavation projects. But here's where the evidence becomes truly extraordinary. The structures being uncovered weren't crude frontier buildings hastily constructed by recent settlers. They demonstrated architectural sophistication that exceeded anything these communities should have possessed according to accepted historical narratives. The stonework showed precision cutting and fitting techniques. The foundations extended to depths that required engineering knowledge beyond what frontier builders typically demonstrated. The proportions followed mathematical relationships that weren't commonly understood in American construction practices. Yet the people excavating these buildings in the 1840s seemed to have no understanding of what they were uncovering. Municipal documents repeatedly described these discovery projects as routine street improvements or drainage modifications, despite photographic evidence showing excavation work that resembled archaeological recovery more than civil engineering. The scale alone defied explanation. In Chicago, entire city blocks required excavation that removed sediment by the thousands of tons. Work crews operated continuously without clear public documentation of funding sources or project management. Streets underwent complete reconstruction after excavation rather than simple grading modifications. Underground spaces discovered during this work often remained sealed rather than incorporated into building plans. If this sediment accumulation resulted from normal flooding or gradual soil deposition, why did cleanup operations resemble systematic archaeological work? Why were the deepest discovery areas left permanently buried? And why did every affected city respond using virtually identical excavation protocols despite having no documented coordination between municipal governments? The evidence points towards something far more organized than random urban development. Someone or some institution was directing these recovery efforts on a scale that transcended individual city planning. Whether these orders originated from federal authorities, private engineering consortiums, or coordinated disaster response organizations, the timing and consistency indicate centralized management of what appeared to be a continent-wide excavation project, and this coordinated effort focused on one specific objective: recovering access to sophisticated architectural elements that geological forces had buried beneath layers of accumulated earth. The connection to advanced construction techniques becomes unavoidable when examining what these excavation projects actually uncovered versus what they chose to leave buried. At this point, two possibilities demanded consideration. Either these cities all experienced natural disasters of identical magnitude within the same narrow time frame, or they were systematically excavating the remains of something that predated their official founding dates. The deeper I investigated, the more the second possibility gained credibility. As the excavation records accumulated from multiple cities, a pattern emerged that challenged every assumption about 19th century urban development. These weren't isolated municipal projects scattered across decades of gradual growth. They were synchronized responses to conditions that appeared simultaneously across vast geographical regions. The documentation reveals something extraordinary. City engineers from Boston to San Francisco encountered identical construction signatures in their buried discoveries. Archival reports describe stonework cut with precision that surpassed contemporary capabilities. Foundation systems engineered to support loads far exceeding what surface structures required. Corridor networks extending beyond individual building footprints into elaborate underground complexes. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't what they found. It was what happened immediately after these discoveries. Project documentation suddenly becomes vague. Detailed engineering reports transform into brief summaries. Photographic records that initially captured every phase of excavation work abruptly stop showing the most significant architectural elements. Then came the systematic concealment. Rather than studying these remarkable discoveries, municipal authorities consistently chose to rebury them. Not because the structures were unstable or dangerous, but because they raised questions that couldn't be answered within accepted historical frameworks. The evidence suggests these burial operations followed standardized protocols. Teams would excavate just enough to restore building access, then immediately seal deeper levels behind new construction. Original architectural elements got covered with conventional materials that appeared more recent. Surface modifications disguised the age and sophistication of underlying structures. This coordination extended beyond individual cities. The same techniques appear in excavation projects, separated by thousands of miles and different governmental jurisdictions. Boston, Chicago, Kansas City, Seattle, and dozens of smaller communities all implemented virtually identical approaches to managing their buried architecture discoveries. Such consistency requires central planning. Municipal governments don't spontaneously develop identical protocols for handling unexpected archaeological finds. Engineering teams don't independently choose the same concealment strategies across different states and territories. The similarity of approach indicates someone was directing these operations according to predetermined guidelines. The photographic evidence becomes crucial here because it captures moments before the concealment protocols took effect. Early excavation images show architectural elements that defy conventional explanations. Massive stone archways buried beneath street level, carved facades extending far below what should have been foundation depth, window arrangements and decorative elements that match sophisticated European cathedral construction rather than frontier American building techniques. These photographs also reveal the scale of earth displacement involved. The accumulated sediment wasn't a thin layer that could result from normal urban runoff or construction debris. It represented meters of dense material that had somehow engulfed entire building levels simultaneously across different climate zones and geographical regions. Geological analysis of this sediment reveals characteristics that don't match local soil composition. The material appears uniform in density and mineral content despite being found in cities with dramatically different environmental conditions. Chicago's excavated earth resembles samples from Seattle's buried levels, which match material found beneath Kansas City streets. This uniformity suggests a common source or formation process that affected vast areas simultaneously. The timing coincides with documented atmospheric disturbances of the 1840s. Volcanic eruptions, unusual weather patterns, and agricultural disruptions that affected global climate systems. These conditions could have produced massive soil displacement through mechanisms that geological science is only beginning to understand. But conventional flood models don't explain the archaeological evidence. Normal flooding deposits sediment gradually and irregularly, creating layers that reflect different events over time. The buried architecture shows signs of rapid, simultaneous burial that preserved structural elements in remarkable detail. Windows remain intact behind earth barriers. Decorative stonework survives without the erosion patterns typical of prolonged exposure to moving water. This preservation suggests a burial process that was swift enough to protect delicate architectural features while being comprehensive enough to affect entire city districts. The sediment appears to have behaved more like a liquid during deposition, then solidified into the compact material that excavation teams encountered decades later. Such behavior matches documented soil liquefaction events, where seismic activity or other geological forces temporarily transform solid ground into fluid-like states. But liquefaction typically affects limited areas for brief periods. The evidence from 1840s excavation projects suggests liquefaction-like conditions that persisted across continental distances for extended time frames. The architectural discoveries provide additional clues about the forces involved. Buried structures show stress patterns consistent with sudden submersion rather than gradual environmental pressure. Stone joints remain tight despite being surrounded by dense earth for decades. Foundation systems maintain structural integrity that wouldn't survive normal flood damage. These preservation characteristics indicate burial conditions that protected rather than destroyed the affected buildings. Most significantly, the architectural sophistication discovered beneath these cities exceeds what their supposed builders could have achieved. The engineering knowledge required for the foundation systems alone surpasses what frontier communities typically possessed. The mathematical precision of structural proportions reflects understanding of principles that weren't commonly taught in American engineering schools until much later periods. These technical capabilities suggest the buried structures originated from a construction tradition that was far more advanced than anything documented in conventional historical accounts. The uniformity of techniques across different geographical regions indicates shared knowledge systems that transcended individual community development. Yet the people excavating these remarkable buildings seem to have no understanding of their significance. Municipal documents describe routine street improvements and drainage modifications. Despite photographic evidence showing archaeological discoveries that should have revolutionized understanding of American architectural history, this disconnect between the evidence and its official interpretation suggests deliberate suppression of information that didn't fit accepted narratives. The systematic concealment operations that followed each discovery indicate coordinated efforts to prevent public awareness of findings that challenged established chronologies. The excavation projects themselves reveal the sophistication of the concealment protocols. Teams possessed detailed knowledge of which architectural elements to preserve for functional purposes and which to bury permanently. They understood how to modify surface appearances to disguise the age and origin of underlying structures. They coordinated timing to complete concealment operations before public attention could focus on the discoveries. Such expertise requires advanced planning and specialized knowledge that exceeds typical municipal engineering capabilities. The consistency of application across different cities indicates centralized training or oversight that transcended local governmental authority. The documentation trail reveals how this concealment system functioned. Initial excavation reports contain detailed descriptions of architectural discoveries. Subsequent reports summarize the same findings in increasingly vague terms. Final documentation focuses entirely on surface construction, while omitting reference to buried elements entirely. This progressive information suppression follows patterns typical of classified project management rather than normal municipal record keeping. The systematic removal of specific details while maintaining general project documentation suggests deliberate efforts to preserve administrative legitimacy while concealing archaeological significance. The photographic evidence provides the most compelling proof of these concealment operations. Early images capture excavation work in progress, showing architectural elements before they disappeared behind new construction. Later photographs of the same locations show conventional building facades with no indication of the sophisticated structures hidden beneath. The technological capabilities required for these concealment operations exceed what 19th century construction techniques should have supported. The precision of architectural modification, the speed of implementation, and the coordination across multiple cities indicate access to resources and expertise that aren't documented in conventional historical accounts. This suggests the excavation projects were managed by organizations that possessed capabilities beyond what municipal governments typically demonstrated. Whether these organizations represented federal authorities, private engineering consortiums, or other institutional structures, their involvement indicates the discoveries were considered significant enough to warrant extraordinary concealment efforts. The archaeological implications become staggering when considered collectively. Dozens of American cities contain buried architectural evidence of sophisticated construction techniques that predate their supposed founding by decades or centuries. These structures demonstrate engineering knowledge, mathematical precision, and artistic sophistication that challenges fundamental assumptions about the development of American civilization. Yet this evidence remains hidden beneath street level, sealed behind conventional construction that disguises its existence. The concealment operations were so thorough that most residents of these cities remain unaware that remarkable archaeological treasures lie buried beneath their daily activities. The systematic nature of these concealment efforts suggests they were implemented to protect specific narratives about American historical development. The buried architecture represents physical proof of capabilities and chronologies that don't align with accepted accounts of westward expansion and frontier settlement. Rather than integrating these discoveries into historical understanding, authorities chose to hide evidence that might complicate established narratives. This decision indicates the archaeological findings were considered threatening enough to established historical frameworks that concealment became preferable to acknowledgement. The implications extend far beyond individual cities or regional history. The coordination required for continent-wide concealment operations suggests institutional capabilities and motivations that transcend local governmental authority. Someone, or some organization, possessed both the resources and the determination to systematically hide archaeological evidence across vast geographical areas. The investigation leads toward questions that conventional historical scholarship has consistently avoided addressing. Who possessed the capability to coordinate such extensive concealment operations? What institutional structures could manage archaeological suppression across multiple governmental jurisdictions? And what discoveries could have been significant enough to warrant such extraordinary efforts at concealment? The answers may lie in understanding the scope of what was actually discovered during these excavation projects. Because when you examine the architectural elements that briefly surfaced before disappearing behind municipal cover-up operations, a disturbing picture emerges of capabilities that shouldn't have existed in 19th century America. The stonework alone defied contemporary explanation. Excavation teams uncovered blocks cut with precision that surpassed anything documented in American quarrying operations. These weren't rough frontier building materials shaped by basic tools. They were geometrically perfect components that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Modern stonemasons examining surviving photographic evidence express bewilderment at the cutting techniques displayed. The surface finishes show characteristics that typically require industrial machinery, yet these structures supposedly predated mechanized stone processing by decades. The jointing methods demonstrate understanding of structural engineering principles that weren't formally taught in American construction schools until the 20th century. Even more puzzling were the architectural proportions discovered beneath these cities. The buried buildings followed mathematical relationships based on sophisticated geometric principles. Room dimensions, ceiling heights, and structural spans reflected knowledge of harmonic ratios and proportional systems that originated in classical European architecture, yet appeared in American frontier towns that supposedly lacked access to such specialized education. The underground networks revealed during excavation work suggested coordination that transcended individual building projects. Tunnel systems connected structures across city blocks in elaborate patterns that resembled planned infrastructure rather than random basement construction. These passages demonstrated engineering expertise in ventilation, drainage, and structural support that exceeded documented capabilities of frontier construction teams. The evidence speaks for itself. Across dozens of American cities, sophisticated architectural elements remain buried beneath street level, sealed behind conventional facades that disguise their existence. The The systematic nature of these concealment operations suggests they were implemented to protect specific narratives about our historical development. What we've uncovered isn't speculation or theory. It's documented archaeological reality that challenges fundamental assumptions about 19th century capabilities and chronologies. The coordination required for continent-wide excavation and concealment operations indicates institutional involvement that transcends local governmental authority. The question isn't whether this evidence exists. The question is what discoveries could have been significant enough to warrant such extraordinary efforts at suppression. Until we're willing to examine what lies beneath our cities, we'll never understand the true scope of what the 1840 flood actually buried.